Welcome, everyone, to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the province took over planning for Toronto's subways, saying the capital city was taking too long to build essential infrastructure. Now, Metrolinx documents show the province's subway plans are years behind schedule.
The city of Stratford has launched a legal challenge of the provincial government's so-called strong mayor powers. We'll look at their case.
And with Honda announcing that it's bailing on a $15 billion investment for Alliston, we'll talk to one of the local MPs about the advisability of continuing public support for the auto sector.
And in your column, my column, I've got something to say about Canada's national electricity policy and why it doesn't exist.
And I'll check in on the continuing aftermath of the Scarborough Southwest Liberal nomination meeting, the results of which are under appeal by one of the losing candidates.
It's Friday, May 22nd, 2026, so let's get to it.
JMM, a little sugar for this beautiful Friday morning.
Yes, indeed.
Actually, Friday evening, isn't it?
Yes. By the time it gets to the TV, it'll be the evening.
By the time it gets to the TV. What are you wearing today?
So this is a new T-shirt. This is a high school physics joke. If you remember your high school physics, distance over time is velocity. So that means that distance raptor over time raptor is velociraptor.
That is a terrible dad joke.
It has nothing to do with Ontario politics, but I liked it, so I'm wearing it.
Okay. Well, thankfully, one of us here actually wears stuff that is relevant to the topics that we generally discuss here. Yeah, exactly right. I am wearing here. I'm going to stand up and show everybody here. That's Sir William Howard Hearst, who was the premier more than 100 years ago. So you're asking, why are you wearing Hearst today? Okay, 26 premiers of Ontario from Confederation to today. Doug Ford's number 26, only one from Sault Ste. Marie. That's this guy. He took over from James Whitney, the only premier to die in office, incidentally, in 1914, as I say, more than 100 years ago. Then in 1919, he lost to the one and only United Farmers of Ontario. Every single premier of Ontario who won an election actually got a second term, with the exception of a few. And William Hearst is one of the few who didn't get a second term. I'm talking about all this now because tonight, Friday night, I'm going to be in Sault Ste. Marie. I guess as you're watching this on television Friday night, I'm actually in Sault Ste. Marie right now. I'm the master of ceremonies at a book launch given by the mayor of the Sault, Matthew Shoemaker, who has contributed to, show the book, a new biography on Sir William Hearst. It's called No Regrets, The Rise and Fall of Sir William Hearst. It's by Brian Douglas Tennyson, and the mayor has written the foreword for the book. So props to Mayor Shoemaker for using his good offices to promote. There's very few books that are written about Ontario premiers. Yeah. So here we have another one. I am about a quarter of the way through it. I will have it read by the time I go to the book launch tomorrow. Tonight, I'm getting all confused about the timeline here. And okay, here we go. What do we call the civic holiday in August in Toronto?
Here it's called Sir John Simcoe Day.
Correct. And in Burlington, what do they call it?
Let's see, Joseph Brand Day?
Correct. And guess what they call it in the Sioux?
I'm going to guess, based on context clues, it's William Hearst Day.
There you go, right? Yeah, so this is good. And hopefully we're going to have Mayor Shoemaker on the program in the days ahead to talk about this book, which I'm really enjoying.
All right, can I borrow your copy when you're done?
You absolutely can, after my father, who's already got dibs on it.
Oh, okay, well, that's fine.
Anything else?
No, I'm
Let's
good.
move on. Off to issue one. Not long after winning the 2018 election, Doug Ford announced a major change in the subway building business. Going forward, Toronto subways would no longer be planned and built by the city and its transit agency, but instead, Metrolinx, a provincial agency, would be in charge of all of that. Queen's Park said Toronto was taking too long to get the job done, and so it was taking over. How's that going?
Turns out, not so well. Mm-hmm. This is based on reporting from the Toronto Star. Shout out to the Star's reporter Andy Takagi, who used Freedom of Information requests to the City of Toronto. So these are not provincial disclosures. This is unaffected by the recent changes to provincial Freedom of Information law. But I want to specify that just to say that information has a way of getting out even when the province tries to control it. And so because the City of Toronto actually has to talk to the province about things like transit planning, it creates a paper trail. That paper trail is, for now, still accessible to Freedom of Information law. So thank you to the Toronto Star. The news itself, though, we already knew the Scarborough subway was going to be delayed. This is a eastward extension of the existing Line 2, the Bloor-Danforth line in Toronto, that is supposed to go further into Scarborough than it already does. We knew that there were delays, including a tunnel boring machine that had been stuck underground near the 401 for most of a year due to soil issues. I am not a geotechnical engineer. I'm not going to say much more than that.
You just play one on TV.
Yeah. But according to the TTC's documents, again, gotten by the Star, it is now unlikely to open before 2033. I will... We've talked about this before on the podcast at some length, but the people of Scarborough currently enjoy less rapid transit than they had only a few years ago because it has taken so long to build, first to agree on and then to build the subway extension, that the Scarborough Rapid Transit, the prior line that was, I guess, built in the 70s.
Yeah, it was the Bill Davis government who put that one in, and they just shut that down, what, a year or two ago?
2 years ago, I think.
2 years
ago? So, yeah, people in Scarborough now have less rapid transit than they did until very recently. And, this whole saga has been going on, I want to say, since the dawn of time, but certainly since I started working as a reporter in 2010 during the mayoral campaign there. Of course, the then the successful candidate for mayor, Rob Ford, railed against the light rail transit plan, said that Scarborough deserved a subway. And then we proceeded to spend most of a decade arguing about that. I will say that the pro-subway voices won the argument at every step of the way and still could not get a subway built in a timely fashion. And now we are looking at something like the 2030s. And this whole saga just makes me very sad and tired.
And if they'd gone for the LRT, it would have been built by now, and Scarborough would not be suffering from this public transit desert, which they are right now.
Yes, and yeah, I don't know what else to add to it except to say that we've made some poor choices.
Well, let's add this. Scarborough is not the only part of the Greater Toronto Area, which is about to suffer some delays as it relates to public transit.
Right. So the line that has gotten less attention in our political debates, but is still another important extension. We are talking about the Yonge North line extension. The Yonge section of Line 1 is the subway that runs underneath us here at TVO. And there has been a proposal on the book for many years to extend Line 1 north into York Region. York Region has, in fact, made a bunch of changes to their planning rules to make it more congenial for subway construction, and they've been quite insistent. They're like, hey, get on it, let's build this. And so the Ford government inherited some planning work that had already been done, but really I think you could fairly say they have accelerated the construction. The problem, of course, is that Line 1 does already exist, and it is already very, very congested, and you cannot extend service north into York Region and just dump a few thousand or 10,000 or tens of thousands new passengers onto the Yonge line without creating chaos further south as it hits the already extremely busy parts south of Eglinton. So the province has always said they're not going to begin service on the Yonge North extension until the Ontario line is open. The Ontario line has also faced construction delays, because of course it has. And so now folks who live in York Region who have been waiting, in the broadest sense, they've been waiting for decades for this Yonge North extension to open. They are waiting at least a little bit longer. Again, per the Star's reporting, we're now talking sometime in the 2030s. It is actually difficult to build subways. Some things are actually just hard, and I'm sure that we could do it better and do it cheaper, but it was never going to be easy, which is part of the reason why people argued for light rail as an alternative in the first place, because it's just intrinsically an easier thing to do. Now, it turns out you can also do light rail badly, and Toronto, unfortunately, has some recent experience with that as well.
John Michael? I'm going to change the subject because you're just getting in a fouler and fouler mood the more we talk about this.
I'm tired and I'm sad.
And with that, let's get off to issue 2. Shortly before the 2022 municipal elections, Premier Doug Ford announced that the mayors of Toronto and Ottawa would be given so-called strong mayor powers, giving those heads of the council the power to reshape municipal bureaucracies and veto some council decisions. In the years since, those powers have been expanded to many, many more mayors. Now, one city says those laws are unconstitutional. I happen to be here with a nerdy municipal stuff expert and charter case expert as well. So this story must have you in heaven. It combines all the things you love.
Just throw some ice cream on top. It's Christmas in May for McGrath. So yes, this item comes to us from Stratford, Ontario, where the province extended strong mayor powers to the mayor of Stratford in 2025. Stratford's council subsequently voted to ask the city solicitor, their top lawyer, whether the law could be challenged constitutionally. This week, the city announced they had launched that challenge. They are asking an Ontario court to declare that the two laws that govern the province's strong mayor powers be declared unconstitutional and of no force or effect.
And what's the argument they're advancing?
So, when we've spoken about this on the podcast before, I have previously referred to these strong mayor powers as minority rule because functionally that is what it allows. The mayor can move policies forward and implement them even if a majority of council opposes him, so long as he has 1/3 of the council on his or her side. This is the core objection that Stratford raises, that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees basic democratic rights to all of us, including, most importantly, the right to vote in Section 3 of the Charter. And that vote has to have some kind of effective meaning. When we cast our ballots for elected representatives, those elected representatives have to have meaningful power in the bodies that we elect, or it's all just kind of a show, right? And so Stratford's argument is that implementing this form of minority rule, of course, what the province calls strong mayor powers, Stratford says that breaches a basic charter right.
Now, we know you're not a geological engineering expert. You just play one on TV. And we also know you're not really a lawyer, but
True.
you will probably be prepared to play one on TV for the next little while to explain whether you think this is a decent charter case.
At least a few minutes.
Yeah.
So if you can guess from the tone of my voice that I am pretty critical of these strong mayor powers. I have been since they were announced. I think when they were first announced, you and I did a bit where I just said it was all frankly kind of bizarre. But I will say that while I am sympathetic to Stratford's argument, honesty compels me here to say that I don't love their chances. And the reason is a different earlier case where the Ford government intervened in municipalities. Our audience must remember when the very early Ford government cut Toronto City Council in half. That was challenged in court. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court said that the charter guarantee of democratic rights in Section 3 does not apply to municipalities, and that this is not an error or gap in the Constitution. This was a deliberate choice by the people who wrote the charter.
So does this suggest that Stratford's case is fairly clear-cut?
Maybe. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to be too definitive here. But I don't think that the Toronto precedent is good news for Stratford. But they do have a related argument that, and I don't know if this is going to survive judicial scrutiny, but it is interesting, so I want to share it here. Remember that the nominal justification for these strong mayor powers is, from the province's perspective, they want municipalities to better be able to execute on provincial priorities like housing and transit construction. Plenty of reason to argue that it has not accomplished either of those goals, but that is the province's justification. Stratford's argument, and I find this interesting, Stratford's argument is that this means that functionally municipalities are being conscripted into delivering provincial policy, implementing provincial policy through municipalities in a way that it would never be permitted to do if they tried to do it through the legislature, right? Whatever else happens at Queen's Park, Doug Ford cannot implement minority rule in the legislature. A very interesting argument, to me at least, a novel argument. Again, not sure it's going to survive judicial review, but I wanted to share it with the audience.
Could this, we're 5 months away from the municipal elections later this year, could this have an impact on any of that?
No, the hearing is not actually even scheduled until November, and any decision from the court would obviously not happen until weeks or months after that. So whatever mayors and councils are elected in October, they will be elected with these strong mayor powers still in place. The one thing I will be keeping an eye on, at least over the next few months, is which cities, if any, attempt to join this lawsuit.
Anything else on this?
No, I'm good.
Can I sort of set up our next interview that we've got coming in?
Yes, please.
Okay, let me try this because you may know I do another little gig in in the very early morning hours on City TV. I do a little thing called Paikin on Politics on breakfast television.
Yes.
And with the recent announcement that Honda was going to pull the plug on its $15 billion earlier announcement to put a major investment into Alliston, Ontario, and its plant up there, I just kind of raised the issue during breakfast television by saying, I wonder if this is causing any of the governments, federal or provincial, who are putting tens of billions of dollars potentially of subsidies into making sure we have a vibrant auto manufacturing sector here. I wonder if they're having pause, or whether we should all have pause about the advisability of doing that. And when I went on X later that day, there was a member of parliament from that area, Simcoe North, named Adam Chambers, who kind of took me on, who kind of said, well, you know what? He kind of went after me for even positing the question about whether we should look into this at all. And I just thought, and then somebody else said, you know what? Why don't you two have it out on TV? So with that, off to Adam Chambers and issue 3. Last week, the province of Ontario got confirmation from Honda that the auto manufacturer was cancelling its $15 billion investment for a new EV rollout in Alliston, Ontario, about an hour north of Toronto. The news came as a terrible blow to both the federal and provincial governments, both of which have spent billions of dollars subsidizing the presence of a robust auto manufacturing sector in Ontario. Does this development raise questions about the wisdom of continuing to subsidize this sector in our province? Well, joining us for that conversation, Adam Chambers. He is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Simcoe North, and we welcome him here to Yonge and Eglinton in Midtown Toronto. Nice to see you, Adam.
It's great to be with you in studio.
Pleasure. J-Man.
So maybe just to start off, can you give us what your initial reaction was when you heard that news about the canceled Honda investment?
Well, very concerning. Obviously there's been some questions about, what was going to happen with that investment given the changes in the marketplace. But you feel for the workers because, of course, they wake up and they're a little bit unsure about the prospects for the industry, certainly with the tariffs coming from the United States. And then again, with large investments that had been planned. And then to hear a little bit, a few weeks ago, even before the official announcement, there was an indication that it might have been being paused, certainly indefinitely. So you think about the workers and then those individuals who supply the parts to that factory. I mean, it's one of, if not the largest, footprints for auto manufacturing, certainly in Canada, but even in North America by any standard. 4,200 people work there on a regular basis, but probably about 30,000 jobs depend on that plant if you include all the feeders. And certainly in our community, where I'm from in Simcoe North, that's a lot of it's a lot of jobs, it's a lot of families, and so that's what you immediately think about when you hear. And then you say, well, how did we? The next question is how did we get here, and could we have thought about this differently?
We're going to get to that question eventually. I do wonder, because this is certainly not the only auto manufacturer who has decided to change their plans and either pause or cancel investments in the province. And I wonder whether you think this should make us question the value of continuing to offer public subsidies to the auto sector to stay here.
You mean in general, like
Yeah.
any kind of subsidies?
Correct.
Well, I think you have to consider a few things. Across the world, but in particular in the United States, this subsidy game has been a very large part of industrial policy. There have been a number of folks in Canada that used to resist the temptation for subsidies on a few bases. Even the current federal government used to say, we don't need to subsidize auto because we have advantages in Canada. We had a corporate tax advantage for some time. Our employee base was very well educated and well skilled.
And we pay healthcare costs, and they don't.
I was just going to say
Yep.
healthcare costs, absolutely, and a favorable exchange rate on a dollar. Like that provided Canada in a manufacturing sector as some kind of advantage. Unfortunately, I think once you get into starting to play the subsidy game, it becomes very difficult to kind of get off that track because you're often just being played against what the next best offer is from a different jurisdiction. Whether it's smart to consider going forward, we should think about, again, the employees and like what would some of these employees do? What are their alternatives inside manufacturing or outside manufacturing? But just auto, 20 years ago, there was about 3 million cars produced. 10 years ago, 2.2 million cars produced. And today, it's about 1.2 million, call it about 50% of what it used to be even since 2015. So the industry has been adjusting substantially over the last 20 years already.
Should we reevaluate the whole subsidy business?
Well, I'm not sure we should reevaluate how governments decide to support. I think we should I do think we should reevaluate, should governments be choosing various kinds of technology and betting on a technology that they're maybe not sure will have market adoption, or at the time that they have market adoption
EVs.
going forward. Example, electric vehicles. You could go back in history to look at different choices governments have made, but what if governments had chosen to support Blu-ray versus 4K or Betamax versus VCR, as opposed to saying, look, like, we should create an environment where, we want companies to invest in technology. We might not choose what technology that is. We want companies to keep jobs here, no question. We want them, encourage them to hire people. We want to encourage them to keep their manufacturing footprint, upgrade their machinery, plant and equipment, but maybe not get so far into picking or trying to nudge the public into choices on consumer behavior.
I mean, it is hard to disentangle those two things, because if you think about, like, the largest big Canadian subsidies that we're talking about right now, were not just about subsidizing EV production, but it was in the context of the American Inflation Reduction Act, right? And there was a real panic among Canadian policymakers that with the very, very large subsidies that the Americans were offering, that we would just see a wholesale abandonment of auto production in Canada. And so the then Trudeau government's policy was in part justified, not just as an EV subsidy, but as a protecting auto jobs here as well. We had to match those subsidies, or the jobs were just going to get sucked south. And I'm wondering, what do you see that as plausible, or do you think that was maybe a gloss on social engineering?
Well, you know what? It's a great point and a very good question. But back to one of the earlier comments I made, when the Inflation Reduction Act first came out, it was the Trudeau government that said, we don't need to match the subsidies because of the advantages that the Canadian manufacturing sector had. And then all of a sudden, the temptation was just so great to go down the subsidy line. But it was not just subsidy to keep jobs. It was a subsidy to almost choose where the market and the manufacturing should go, which was, hey, we're going to go all in on electric vehicles. And in at least Honda's case, and I have to say about Honda, this is not a decision that Honda would make lightly, there's no question. But Honda is probably one of the most generous and long-term employers that the country has seen. They have never issued a layoff notice in their entire existence in Canada since about 1985 or in that time frame.
40 years, yep.
40 years. They have never once, issued a layoff notice, which I think is a sign of their commitment to Canada long term. But what happened in their circumstance was when the federal government and provincial governments put a subsidy in the window for electric vehicles, they chose to move, that encouraged them to move existing traditional manufacturing from one of their engine lines down to the United States to make room for the electric vehicle production.
So did we make a mistake by doubling, even tripling down on the whole EV sector?
Look, I think so, and it might just be an issue of timing. Like, I don't think anyone's suggesting that no one will ever drive EVs at all. I think what we're saying is it may have been too fast, too soon, but the choices that governments made, multiple levels of government, to try to nudge the industry in that direction actually ended up putting it more at risk, because we've moved traditional manufacturing away in favor of electric vehicle production, but now the market's not there, and companies need to make different decisions. And frankly, I just quickly on the electric vehicles, the government went all in on just electric vehicles, like 100% battery versus maybe allowing the plug-in hybrids to really take forward. I think in a country like Canada, the plug-in hybrid model seems to be actually quite attractive. If your vehicle can go 50 kilometers without a charge, I mean, most people's daily driving habits would be covered by plug-ins. But even that technology was not favored by the federal regulations.
Full disclosure, I drive a Chevy Volt.
Oh, perfect, yeah.
It plugs in. I get about 80 kilometers a day of battery power, and then it automatically goes to gas.
Right.
And I mean, 5% of my driving is more than 80 kilometers a day, right? It's always less than that. So I'm driving by gas stations a lot. And I must confess, I'm a little surprised that this was not a technology that was more favored. They don't even make them anymore.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because we had suggested at the time, or there was people talking about these battery subsidies and saying, well, and my point was at the time, you could probably deliver 80, maybe 90% of the government's emissions reduction targets by going 100% plug-in hybrid and really allowing that market to grow just because of people's daily driving habits. And you know what? Maybe a fully electric vehicle might make sense for somebody's second vehicle, like if they have a family or, I think there's different models of where in lifestyles where the fully electric vehicle might work, but certainly the plug-in hybrids have a great value proposition to consumers.
I am also a big fan of that idea in general. I will say just for the record that there are people who dispute whether plug-in hybrids can actually deliver the emission reductions that are promised. There's been some work in Europe to suggest that they...
Doesn't my case.
Yeah, but I guess it depends on how often you... Exactly.
So like one of the issues is basically like people don't charge them up as often.
Oh, I see.
And they rely more on the gasoline usage than they necessarily need to. But I don't want to get too far down that road. I think one of the obvious points of context in all of this is the relationship with the United States. We already mentioned the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, of course, Donald Trump has returned to the White House. And I'm wondering what you think the now slightly more acrimonious relationship with the United States means to this current moment and maybe the future of the auto sector.
Well, I mean, it's not, it has taken a negative turn. There's no question about it. When the president imposes tariffs, largely unjustified tariffs in any circumstance on the automotive sector, that's a direct attack. And I mean, even the president has said, we don't need to buy Canadian vehicles. We're going to make them all ourselves.
Canadian auto jobs are all stolen from the United States.
I mean, his objective appears to be to take as many auto jobs from wherever he can get them, including Mexico, and bring them into the United States. So I think that is short-sighted on a couple fronts. The first would be, Canadians purchase a heck of a lot of American-made vehicles. Just take the Ford F-150 as an example. One of the best-selling vehicles for quite some number of years in Canada. That is completely imported. It's assembled out in the United States and brought into Canada. We bring a lot of vehicles in from the United States tariff-free. I think the president, I'm sure we could probably make a deal. Well, our suggestion has been to consider what the old auto pack days looked like, whereas if we buy a certain number of vehicles from you, tariff-free, Canada would get to send a number of vehicles down to the United States, tariff-free. So I think that's a challenge. But I would also say, back to government policy, in an effort to continue subsidizing or keeping up with the electric vehicle objectives of the government, and this is Prime Minister Carney's direct choice just recently, was bringing back electric vehicle rebates. $2.3 billion of taxpayer money to buy electric vehicles. By the way, fully electric is subsidized more than plug-in hybrids. So again, you have a bit of a preference there. And it's front-end loaded. So the rebates are actually higher right now than they are in a few years. Right. Well, we don't actually produce in Canada very many electric vehicles. Where are those electric vehicles being produced? Some of them are being produced in the US, some of them from around the world, but many of them being produced in the US.
But that's a pollution abatement measure.
Well, let's think about this.
To encourage people to buy cars that don't spew as much pollution into the air.
Absolutely. But the current context with our discussion with the Americans are we're using Canadian taxpayer dollars to give to consumers to purchase vehicles not assembled in Canada. And worse, assembled in the United States, with whom the president is attacking our auto sector. So you just think about, should we be giving Canadians taxpayer dollars to purchase vehicles from the country with which they're trying to steal all of our auto jobs? Not sure. One of the ideas we've had is said, well, let's take the GST off of all Canadian assembled vehicles. And you can reward someone for buying the vehicle from the Honda plant, from the Toyota plant. Why don't we consider that as an alternative? If we have
Can we do that, or would that break any WTO rules or NAFTA rules or whatever?
Well, I would say that I think the president seems to ignore some of those rules. I think at least we should consider how far we're willing to push that. But if we have a limited number of financial resources in Ottawa, instead of paying Canadians to buy American assembled vehicles, let's pay them to buy Canadian assembled vehicles.
I'll just do one other point on your
Sure.
position of the U.S. Made EVs. I mean, the geography here is even less favorable to Canada because the American-made EVs are either Teslas or it's like Hyundai and Kia, and the plants that make those are all located not around Michigan, where, at least in theory, Canadian auto parts could be fed into the assembly, but these are all southern U.S. plants closer to Mexico. So right now, Canadian purchases of EVs are going to benefit a totally different sort of food chain for the auto sector.
You know what? I'm really glad you brought that up for two reasons. The supply chain, as you point out, is completely different for electric vehicles as it is for what we call the internal combustion ones. Yeah. The second is, like you mentioned, Tesla. Under the old electric vehicle mandate that the federal government had, it was basically rewarding Tesla because your manufacturers had to purchase credits, electric vehicle credits, from manufacturers who had an overabundance of credits. So if you didn't produce enough electric vehicles, you then had to buy credits from another manufacturer. Well, there was only one manufacturer that was able to sell credits into the market, Tesla. Yeah. So the Canadian government policy was actually supporting or enriching, quote unquote, an American domiciled, non-Canadian tax-paying entity, which again, you just question, government policy as, a bit of an absurd result, I think. If Canadians knew that the policy was favoring Tesla, would they be as, that confident in the policy or that supportive of the policy?
There are some ironies here, aren't there?
Yeah, I think so.
I want to get you to comment on something we've heard increasingly, I think, in the last couple of weeks, which is to say Australia used to have a fairly robust auto manufacturing sector. And then they just decided, we've had it with trying to subsidize, I think their word was stronger, maybe bribe auto companies to stay in Australia, and we're just going to end the subsidies and let's let the market take over. And the market did take over. All the auto manufacturers left, and they don't make cars in Australia anymore. But the people found new jobs, and the economy did not go into recession. In fact, I think it barely skipped a beat. And I wonder what you think would happen in this province if we took the same approach. No more subsidies for the auto sector. If they can, let them sink or swim. Exactly, based on free enterprise.
Well, I actually think the sector would not completely disappear. I do think because of our proximity to the United States, assuming that we could repair or reinvigorate the relationship with the United States, I think that is a benefit to the Canadian auto sector and, frankly, the Canadian manufacturing sector as a whole, to have the proximity to the largest, consumer market in the world. So I actually think the sector is viable,
provided we get access to the U.S. market.
Exactly. And I have been starting to say now, no access. If there is no access to the American market for vehicles, I think the industry would have a very serious problem. So that, I think, is primarily the first thing we have to fix. And I frankly think that I have actually quite a lot of faith in Canadian workers to be competitive, especially in the automotive manufacturing sector. If you go to a place like Honda, like there are things they can do in that plant in Canada that and at efficiency levels that they cannot get elsewhere. I actually think the sector would be quite sustainable without as much subsidies or without the need to have as many subsidies. But I do think the benefit that we have is being close to the United States, even though it doesn't, emotionally, it doesn't seem like a benefit these days given the president's rhetoric. But I do think over time that's an opportunity to maintain a manufacturing sector here.
It's an interesting answer you've given, Adam, because you've got tens of thousands of people in and around your constituency who are working in this industry right now. If we stop the subsidies, do you think they'd all be out of luck?
Well, I would say this. I think before we get to the subsidy question, we have to confirm and reestablish access to the United States market. That, in my view, is the most important pressing concern for those workers in the sector right now. And once we do that, then I think we could have a conversation about subsidies, yes or no, or which ones should be available, and are they subsidies that should be available to any company or any manufacturing sector, period. You know, for example, the ability to write off property, plant, and equipment right away, you know, what they call accelerated capital cost depreciation, those kinds of things that would be available to every company, not just, you know, the automotive sector. So I think, you know, you could have a very interesting and in-depth discussion about subsidies, yes or no, and then which ones actually might make sense.
We are, of course, a provincial politics podcast, but we've got you here, so we're going to ask you a federal politics question. I mean, if the Conservative Party were the majority in the Commons, had formed government instead of the Liberal Party, what would you be doing differently?
Well, first, I would say the advice that we give to all parties when there's a dispute, you know, to Canada Post when they're having labor disputes, to the railways when they're having labor disputes, to the airlines when they were having labor disputes just recently, we say, well, the parties should be at the table. So the first thing we have to do is we actually have to have an ongoing formal dialogue with the Americans about our trade irritants on both sides of the table. And if you can look, you know, I'll use Mexico as an example. They have taken a slightly different approach than the current Liberal government in terms of they've tried to take emotion out of it, but they've been having consistent formal negotiations with the Americans about their issues. I think, number one, we should be at the table with the Americans. Number two, I think we should also be considering these old Autopac Day type arrangements if the U.S. wants to go down this tariff road. By the way, the pre-1900s, the U.S. basically, its entire policy was tariff rate policy. So these are not new visions that the president has. He hasn't invented the word tariff. But if they want to go down that road, then reciprocity is important. So we've said, well, why don't we start having discussions about this Autopac formula, which is if we buy a certain number of cars, we'll want them tariff-free from the U.S., but then that will enable us to send a certain number of vehicles down to them. Unfortunately, given the environment with the Americans, we have not even mentioned the word autos at a formal or informal meeting with them. And that's confirmed both by the Canadians and both by the Americans close to the discussions. But if you're not at the table, you're not able to have these kinds of discussions to work out our issues. So those are two, very specific things I think that we would have done differently or would like to be doing differently. We've been encouraging them, the parties to be at the table.
After all this doom and gloom, let us finish on a happy note. It is often said that you folks on Parliament Hill can't agree on anything. If the sky is blue, someone's going to say it's not. But there was a kind of rare and happy moment of unanimity that you had a big part in not too long ago. What happened?
Well, I had a private member's bill, and thanks for asking, Steve. I think it's wonderful to highlight these circumstances when they occur, because I think if people come to watch Question Period or watch it on TV, they would have a very different impression about what regular life is like when the cameras are off. But I had a private member's bill that was passed unanimously by the House just before we left a couple weeks ago. Unanimously, that's right. So, which is a rare feat, although it does happen, but a rare feat, but an opportunity to highlight collaboration. And basically, if I can 30-second pitch on the bill, the Canada Revenue Agency is the primary debt collector on behalf of the government. But that means they also have the ability to waive or forgive debts that they're supposed to collect. And as it relates to debts that corporations owe the government, we were noticing that the numbers of write-offs were increasing substantially, like hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars a year. So every time the government decides to write off a debt that is in for a corporation over a threshold, that will be publicly disclosed for the taxpayers and for journalists to see, which I think is a great transparency measure and a way to hold the government accountable for its primary objectives, which is to collect the taxes that corporations owe it.
Congratulations.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate it. And thanks for letting me explain that to your listeners.
That's Adam Chambers. He is the Member of Parliament for Simcoe North, and we're grateful that you've made the trek down from, some days on a good day, an hour north of us. On a bad day, an hour and a half, 2 hours north of us. Yeah, to come down in Midtown Toronto.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to join you both here today.
All right, time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for the TVO website, tvo.org. This past week, we talk about them here. We tease you with a little bit of goodies and hope you'll go to the website and check it out. What do you got for us this week?
So I periodically get cranky about national news coverage in this country because...
Periodically?
Certain issues get covered as if the provinces don't matter or people ignore the provinces. And of course, I'm talking my book here because I am employed to cover provincial politics and policy. But last week, Prime Minister Mark Carney and the federal government released this white paper announcing a national electricity strategy. And truly, like on its own merits, the document itself is mostly inoffensive. It's a bunch of good ideas about electricity policy. And yet, we mentioned last week I was not feeling my best, and that may have contributed to this. But as I read this document more and more, I just got more and more cranky because national electricity policy is irrelevant. It is the provinces that will be making all of the important decisions about what electrical power we generate, what transmission lines we build, how local electrical utilities are regulated. It just was driving me nuts that in all of this discussion about a federal electricity policy, I was screaming like, none of this matters.
Well, they do put a little money into it.
Yes, and I will say, specifically in the area of nuclear power, there is a very strong federal role. Nuclear technology is federally regulated in Canada, and so in the case of Ontario, where like more than half of our electricity comes from nuclear power, there is some federal role there. But that is because the province of Ontario has made the choice provincially to rely so heavily on nuclear power. If we did not rely on nuclear power, the federal role would be much reduced, right? In general, I would say the role of the federal government is, and we talked a little bit about this about EVs, right? The federal government can subsidize types of electricity demand, right? We can give people subsidies for electric vehicles. We can give people grants or low interest loans to buy things like heat pumps for their homes. And I think that's really the appropriate and proper role for the federal government. The problem that I get to in my column is that it does set up an analogous problem to what we just saw happen with immigration, where the federal government welcomed in a bunch of new immigration while the provinces did not, for the most part, deliver a bunch of new housing. We saw rent spiral, immigration politics turn to toxic, and now we have the federal government backpedaling furiously on immigration numbers. Similarly, you could imagine a scenario in which the federal government subsidizes a bunch of new electricity demand, and the provinces do not make a whole bunch of electricity supply available, and you could see either spiraling prices or blackouts or whatever. Then I give a bit of a cheeky political suggestion to the federal government, but if you want to see that, I will say you should go read the column on tvo.org.
There we go. Good plug, good plug.
And you?
I am still fascinated by the fallout from the Liberal nomination meeting in Scarborough Southwest that happened a couple of weekends ago. What happened here this past week? Wednesday, so a couple of nights ago, Wednesday night at the Sheraton Hotel in downtown Toronto, they heard the appeal. Nate Erskine Smith, who came second by 19 votes to Ahsan al-Hafiz, he filed a formal complaint and asked a Liberal tribunal to look into the irregularities that he claimed took place. Just by mentioning a few of them here, he said there were a number of people who voted at this Liberal nomination meeting who didn't bring forward proper ID, and yet they were allowed to vote anyway. He said there were people who were caught taking pictures of their ballots, which of course is a big no-no. It suggests that perhaps you've been paid to vote a certain way. as we sit here taping this right now, we have not heard the verdict of the appeal tribunal on this case. We may never find out what the reasons are for the decision that the tribunal will make, because it's actually a part of the Liberal Party's constitution that everybody has to respect the kind of omerta surrounding all of this. They will, of course, announce at some point what their decision is. They have vast powers here, actually, JMM. They can say, your complaints are irrelevant and we're going to take the meeting as it happened. Or they can say, you've made a pretty good point here and we're going to order a new meeting, a new nomination meeting, or, a bunch of options in between. But all sides involved are supposed to keep quiet about what was actually discussed behind closed doors. So we're going to continue to keep an eye on this thing because, nomination meetings from all parties tend to stink.
Yes.
They tend to really not be great exercises in democracy. There's lots of corner cutting and lots of irregularities. I'm not saying necessarily in this case, but they do happen. And it's an opportunity for, if they wanted to, it's an opportunity for parties to clean this up a lot.
Yeah, I do think that one of the things we are going to have to discuss at some point, when we talk about democratic reforms in Ontario, I think we tend to go straight to we need proportional representation, or we want to talk about some big showy reform to the legislature itself. And there are, frankly, so many other small d democratic reforms that we could look at, and party nominations being just one of them. But I do think this is one of those cases where nobody wants to be the first to jump, and it probably need, in much the same way that we saw the parties not quite discreetly, but they all agreed to not bash each other over the pension issue, the return of MPP pensions. I think we'll need some kind of multilateral peace settlement amongst the parties to really address this.
And you never know, could happen. Absolutely. Could happen. Okay, shall we check the mailbag?
Yes, indeed.
We do want to remind people that if they've got a burning question or insightful comment that they want to lay on us, we have a special address for that. onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what's in this week's mailbag?
We have a letter from Hamilton. Hi, Steve and JMM. I'm a new fan of the podcast, and I appreciate your hard work. My name is Zach, and I'm from Toronto, and I attend McMaster University. Shout out Hamilton.
Hear, hear.
Recently, the Toronto District School Board announced major cuts to several areas, including the elimination of the Model Schools program and the closure of 5 out of 7 outdoor education centres following 2 closures last year. I'm working as an intern this spring at one of the outdoor education centres slated to close, and I've seen the incredible positive impact these trips have on students. My question for you is the province underfunding education to the point where boards have no choice but to cut programs like this, or is the TDSB making bad spending decisions? Thanks, Zach.
Zach, this is a great question, and boy, is it a complicated answer. Because if you look at the last Ontario budget, the Ministry of Education for the province of Ontario is getting $40 billion to spend. There has never been a higher number in the history of the province of Ontario than that 40 billion number. It sounds like it is. It's an enormous amount of money.
That's like 3 Hondas worth of
That's 3 Honda plants. Yes. That's right. However, as your letter suggests, once you start sending that money out into the hinterland and it gets diffused, maybe it doesn't quite go as far as we wish it would.
Right. And, I was digging through some of the TDSB's budget docs to try and get a sense of how much money are we actually talking about here. And it's a few $1,000,000. It is not an enormous sum, even by the standards of a Toronto budget, right? Like the city of Toronto is not the school board. I want to be clear about that. But the city of Toronto has, I think it's $10 billion operating annual budget. It's
20.
It's very large. Objectively, this should not be a hard sum of money to find if it were a provincial priority, for example, or even if the city of Toronto wanted to find that money. But we keep the city and the school board's functions separate. And that's a whole interesting discussion because, of course, some jurisdictions don't do that, right? Like the mayor of New York City is also in charge of the school system there. But, additionally, it is really difficult to overstate just how much of a bind school boards are in Ontario, particularly with the city of Toronto. You've got a bunch of different issues. It has very large legacy costs because the Toronto District School Board was largely built to educate the baby boom generation, that massive demographic surge, there's no baby boom on the horizon right now, and so the TDSB has more schools than it needs for its student body. But additionally, there's a provincial moratorium, and it is not allowed to close surplus school sites at the moment. Additionally, this was not a decision by the school board itself, right? The TDSB is currently under provincial supervision. Even if this decision was made by staff, I can't imagine the school board trustees all agree and love with this decision, but ultimately, they are not the ones making that call. The final point I would make is that school boards across Ontario get the majority of their funding from the province, right? There's still a small amount that they get, like a symbolic amount that they get from the local tax base, but overwhelmingly the money comes from the province, and that comes with strings. And the province says to school boards, like, you are going to get this much money, but you cannot spend it on things outside of the core student need, right? The biggest grant is called the Grant for Student Needs. And so I don't know for certain whether these outdoor education centers are allowed to be funded by the main provincial grants. I kind of suspect not. But school boards have so many competing pressures, not a ton of financial leeway. Zach did also ask, is the TDSB not being well managed? And without making a judgment about this specific case, I will just say, there is an extremely long history of, certainly the perspective being from Queen's Park, whether you want to talk Liberal or Conservative premiers, there is a long history of premiers saying, oh my God, the TDSB cannot keep its books straight. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but that includes premiers who were very vocally pro-education spending, like Kathleen Wynne. Under her tenure, she had a special report drawn up into the operations of the TDSB that was extremely critical about the management at the TDSB. So I don't want to say that this specifically is the result of the board's financial choices, but there is also a history here that we can be aware of.
There's also a political philosophy that may come to play here, and that philosophy is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And Zach, I guess the last thing we'd say about this is, if you want to make a stink about this and you want to keep these centers open, then make a stink about it.
And I will just add that as somebody who did go through the TDSB system, I don't think I went to, I did go to the Island School, and that's one of the outdoor education centers that is slated for closure. I also went to a different one at Boyne River. Those, I have very, very fond memories of those places. It would make me personally very sad if the next generation did not have access to those places. I won't make a comment about the financial wisdom of them, but I certainly hope that we can find some way to keep the money around.
Zach, there you go. McGrath's ready to join your campaign right now. He'll be the honorary chair of your effort.
They're on the barricades.
Very good. Give the email address, JMM, and let's get out of here.
All right. Again, if you'd like to ask about content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, May 22nd, 2026.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please be sure to include your first and last name and where you're from.
This week's episode was produced by Tiff Lamb, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. Vanessa Case is our new vice president of media. Welcome to TVO, Vanessa.
Yes, indeed. And we look forward to many happy years of collaborating with you, Vanessa. I just met her actually today for the first time, and welcome aboard, as they say. We also, of course, at this time, always love to give a shout out to our crew for their efforts to make this podcast look as good as possible. And a special shout out this week to the woman behind camera 3 right over there, Tina Zavagno, who had a birthday last week and is now enjoying the last vestiges of her 50s. Tina, enjoy. And to the rest of you, until next Friday, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.